The Grand Mosque seizure occurred during November and December 1979 when extremist insurgents calling for the overthrow of the House of Saud took over Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. The insurgents declared that the Mahdi had arrived in the form of one of the leaders, Mohammed Abdullah al-Qahtani, and called on Muslims to obey him. The seizure of Islam's holiest site, the taking of hostages from among the worshippers, and the deaths of hundreds of militants, security forces and hostages caught in crossfire in the ensuing battles for control of the site, all shocked the Islamic world. The siege ended 2 weeks after the takeover began and the mosque was cleared. Following the attack, the Saudi state implemented a stricter enforcement of Islamic code. Background: the seizure was led by Jew Hayman al-Otaibi, a member of an influential family in Najd. He declared his brother-in-law Mohammed Abdullah al-Qahtani to be the Mahdi, or Redeemer, who arrives on earth several years before Judgment Day. His followers embellished the fact that al-Qahtani's name and his father's name are identical to Prophet Muhammad's name and that of his father, and developed a saying, his and his father's names were the same as Muhammad's and his father's, and he had come to Mecca from the north. To justify the belief, the date of the attack, the 20th of November 1979, was the first day of the year 1400 according to the Islamic calendar, which was stated by another hadith as the day that a mujaddid would reveal himself. Al-Otaibi was from one of the foremost families of Najd. His grandfather had ridden with Ibn Saud in the early decades of the century and other of his family members were among foremost of the Ikhwan. He was a preacher, a former corporal in the Saudi National Guard, and a former student of Sheikh Abdul Aziz al-Baz, who went on to become the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia. Goals: Jew Hayman had turned against al-Baz, and began advocating a return to the original ways of Islam. Among other things, a repudiation of the West, abolition of television and expulsion of non-Muslims. He proclaimed that the ruling al-Saud dynasty had lost its legitimacy because it was corrupt, ostentatious and had destroyed Saudi culture by an aggressive policy of westernization. Al-Otaibi and Qahtani had met while being imprisoned together for sedition. When al-Otaibi claimed to have a vision sent by God telling him that Qahtani was the Mahdi, the declared goal was to institute a theocracy in preparation for the imminent apocalypse. They differed from the original Ikhwan and other earlier Wahhabi purists in that they were millenarians. They rejected the monarchy and they condemned the Wahhabi ulama. Relations with ulama. Many of their followers were drawn from theology students at the Islamic University in Medina. Al-Otaibi joined the local chapter of the Salafi group al-Jama'ah al-Salafiyya al-Mutaziba in Medina, headed by the renowned Sheikh Abdulaziz ibn Baz, chairman of the Permanent Committee for Islamic Research and issuing fatwas at the time. The followers preached the radical message in different mosques in Saudi Arabia without being arrested. The government was reluctant to confront religious extremists. When Al-Otaibi, al-Qahtani and a number of the Ikhwan were locked up as troublemakers by the Ministry of Interior Security Police in 1978, members of the ulama cross-examined them for heresy, but they were subsequently released as being traditionalists harkening back to the Ikhwan, like al-Otaibi's grandfather, and not a threat. Even after the seizure of the Masjid, a certain level of forbearance by ulama for the rebels remained. When the government asked for a fatwa allowing armed force in the Masjid, the language of Bin Baz and other senior ulama was curiously restrained. The scholars did not declare al-Otaibi and his followers non-Muslims, despite the violation of the sanctity of the Masjid. but only termed them al-Jama'a al-Musallaha. The senior scholars also insisted that before security forces attacked them, the authorities must offer them the option to surrender. Preparations because of donations from wealthy followers. The group was well armed and trained. Some members, like al-Haram, were former military officials of the National Guard. Some National Guard troops sympathetic to the insurgents smuggled weapons, ammunition, gas masks, and provisions into the mosque compound over a period of weeks before the new year. Automatic weapons were smuggled from National Guard armories, and the supplies were hidden in the hundreds of tiny underground rooms under the mosque that were used as hermitages. Seizure. In the early morning of the 20th of November 1979, the Imam of the Grand Mosque, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullah, was preparing to lead prayers for the 50,000 worshippers who had gathered for prayer. At around 5 a.m., he was interrupted by insurgents who produced weapons from under the robes, chained the gates shut and killed 2 policemen who were armed with only wooden clubs for disciplining unruly pilgrims. The number of insurgents has been given as at least 500 or 4 to 500, and included several women and children who had joined al-Haram's movement. At the time, the Grand Mosque was being renovated by the Saudi bin Laden group. An employee of the organization was able to report the seizure to the outside world before the insurgents cut the telephone lines. The insurgents released most of the hostages and locked the remainder in the sanctuary. They took defensive positions in the upper levels of the mosque, and sniper positions in the minarets from which they commanded the grounds. No one outside the mosque knew how many hostages remained, how many militants were in the mosque, and what sort of preparations they had made. At the time of the event, Crown Prince Fahd was in Tunisia for a meeting of the Arab Summit. The commander of the National Guard, Prince Abdullah, was also abroad for an official visit to Morocco. Therefore, King Khalid assigned the responsibility to Prince Sultan, then Minister of Defense, and Prince Naif, then Minister of Interior, to deal with the incident. Siege. Soon after the rebel seizure, about 100 security officers of the Ministry of Interior attempted to retake the mosque, but were turned back with heavy casualties. The survivors were quickly joined by units of the Saudi Arabian Army and Saudi Arabian National Guard. By the evening, the entire city of Mecca had been evacuated. Prince Sultan appointed Turki bin Faisal al-Saud, head of the al-Mukhabarat al-Amma, to take over the forward command post several hundred meters from the mosque, where Prince Turki would remain for the next several weeks. However, the first order of business was to seek the approval of the ulema, which was led by Abdulaziz bin Baz. Islam forbids any violence within the Grand Mosque, to the extent that plants cannot be uprooted without explicit religious sanction. Ibn Baz found himself in a delicate situation, especially as he had previously taught al-Haram in Medina. Regardless, the ulema issued a fatwa allowing deadly force to be used in retaking the mosque. With religious approval granted, Saudi forces launched frontal assaults on 3 of the main gates. Again, the assaulting force was repulsed as they were unable to break through the insurgents' defenses. Snipers continued to pick off soldiers who revealed themselves. The insurgents aired their demands from the mosque's loudspeakers throughout the streets of Mecca, calling for the cut-off of oil exports to the United States and the expulsion of all foreign civilian and military experts from the Arabian Peninsula. In Beirut, an opposition organization issued a statement on the 25th of November, alleging to clarify the demands of the insurgents. The party, however, denied any involvement of its own in the seizure. Officially, the Saudi government took the the position of not aggressively taking the mosque, but rather to starve the militants. Nevertheless, several unsuccessful assaults were undertaken, at least one of them through the underground tunnels in and around the mosque. According to Lawrence Wright in the book The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11, a team of 3 French commandos from the Groupe d'Intervention de la Gendarmerie Nationale arrived in Mecca. Because of the prohibition against non-Muslims entering the holy city, they converted to Islam in a brief, formal ceremony. The commandos pumped gas into the underground chambers, but perhaps because the rooms were so bafflingly interconnected, the gas failed and the resistance continued, with casualties climbing. Saudi forces drilled holes into the courtyard and dropped grenades into the rooms below, indiscriminately killing many hostages but driving the remaining rebels into more open areas where they could be picked off by sharpshooters. More than 2 weeks after the assault began, the surviving rebels finally surrendered. However, this account is contradicted by at least 2 other accounts, including that of then GIGN commanding officer Christian Proutot. The 3 GIGN commandos trained and equipped the Saudi forces and devised their attack plan, but did not take part in the action and did not set foot in the mosque. He claims that Pakistani SSG commandos carried out the operation instead. The Saudi National Guard and the Saudi Army suffered heavy casualties. Tear gas was used to force out the remaining militants. According to a U.S. Embassy cable of 1 December, several of the militant leaders escaped the siege and days later sporadic fighting erupted in other parts of the city. The battle had lasted for more than 2 weeks, and had officially left 255 pilgrims, troops and fanatics killed and another 560 injured, although diplomats suggested the toll was higher. Military casualties were 127 dead and 451 injured. Aftermath: prisoners, trials and executions. Shortly after news of the takeover was released, the new Islamic revolutionary leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, told radio listeners, "It is not beyond guessing that this is the work of criminal American imperialism and international Zionism." Anger fueled by these rumors spread anti-American demonstrations throughout the Muslim world, in the Philippines, Turkey, Bangladesh, Eastern Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Pakistan. In Islamabad, Pakistan, on the day following the takeover, the U.S. embassy in that city was overrun by a mob, which burned the embassy to the ground. A week later, in Tripoli, Libya, another mob attacked and burned the U.S. embassy. Al-Qahtani was killed in the recapture of the mosque, but Juhayman and 67 of his fellow rebels who survived the assault were captured and later beheaded. They were not shown leniency. The king secured a fatwa from the Council of Senior Scholars which found the defendants guilty of 7 crimes: violating the Masjid al-Haram's sanctity, violating the sanctity of the month of Muharram, killing fellow Muslims, disobeying legitimate authorities, suspending prayer at Masjid al-Haram, erring in identifying the Mahdi, exploiting the innocent for criminal acts. On the 9th of January 1980, 63 rebels were publicly beheaded in the squares of 8 Saudi cities. According to Sandra Maki, the locations were carefully chosen not only to give maximum exposure but, one suspects, to reach other potential nests of discontent. Policies. Saudi King Khalid, however, did not react to the upheaval by cracking down on religious Puritans in general, but by giving the ulama and religious conservatives more power over the next decade. He is thought to have believed that the solution to the religious upheaval was simple: more religion. First, photographs of women in newspapers were banned, then women on television. Cinemas and music shops were shut down. School curriculum was changed to provide many more hours of religious studies, eliminating classes on subjects like non-Islamic history. Gender segregation was extended to the humblest coffee shop. The religious police became more assertive.